Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight, part 5, and we're going to be looking at family systems, understanding your family. And man, can't we all need a lesson in how to understand our family? I don't know about you, but sometimes I feel like a master class might scratch the surface in terms of understanding my family. But I'm excited to hear what Craig has to share with us this evening. Just a reminder, we do have a giveaway again tonight, and the best way you can ensure that you actually have a chance at winning something is to make sure your name is in the bowl in the back, and we will have that drawing afterwards. Before we start, let's just bow our heads for a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for your goodness, for your love and mercy. And as we gather this evening, I pray that you will once again come near to us, open our hearts and our minds, that we may be receptive of what is being shared, and that we will see where it applies in our lives, and how we can be better family members within our families. Thank you for your goodness. Thank you for your love. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
Amen. Well, hello again. I'm so glad you came back. It's been a joy to be with you all here this week. And I can remember a friend of mine from college. His name is John, and that's actually his real name. That's not a made-up name because, John, but my friend John, such a good guy, and he's a few years older than I, and he had a younger sister, just a neat family. Met his parents, and I thought John's family was perfect. I just thought they were so nice to each other and got along all the time, and were just always laughing and all that. And John graduated and started work, and then a year or two later I graduated and started work in a similar area. And at one point, I was in between apartments. As a young single adult, I was in between apartments. I needed a place to stay. And John said, well, you can stay with my folks. I'm like, perfect, that's great. And I moved in with John's folks for a couple of weeks. It was just a couple of weeks. And I learned they weren't as perfect as I had imagined, And that phrase, the grass is greener on the other side, yeah, that's because of all the fertilizer, That's what I finally learned. But families are just wonderfully complex, and we at least have to take a little step back and realize we're all human, and at the end of the day, most of us are doing the best we can with what we have. And to extend some grace to one another. But there can be some intense times. And it's during those intense times, we're going to unpack 4 characteristics tonight of family systems. And it's really about any sort of relationships, but it kind of applies directly to families. But we also see how it applies to congregations, because a congregation of people is just a big collection of families. And we all bring our toys to the playground, and we all bring our dysfunction, we all bring our attitudes, our biases, the way we see life and the world around us. And so a congregation is a very, very complex family system. And so these simple principles, again, are mostly easy to understand, hard to practice. But that's kind of the theme of a lot of what I'm teaching, right? Easy to understand, but hard to practice. So we have our dashboard that we've been looking at here each evening. And again, the dashboard is simply a tool of self-awareness. This is your dashboard. It's revealing to you, or it's giving you signs of what's going on around you. Maybe there's a blind spot monitor that the little light comes on. Hey, watch out, Or maybe the engine light's on, service needed, or rest needed. whatever it might be. Maybe there's been enough miles, it's time for an oil change or whatever else. We're going to talk about systems tonight. And when thinking about systems, it can be looked at in a variety of ways. If you can imagine each member of a system being one puzzle piece, and you have the picture of the puzzle, right? And you're seeing where everything fits and that kind of thing. Well, each of us isn't so unique that we only have one spot to fit. It's like one of those crazy puzzles where all the pieces look similar in shape, but they all have something different on there, so it gets a little wonky. But systems thinking strives to look at the emotional process going on among people while never losing sight of the facts of a given situation. There's several different definitions we'll look at here, but rather than trying for control, we talked a little bit about control, we'll talk a little bit more about control, or blaming. That was one of the top 5 of a chronically anxious system. We first want to react, and then the next one is we want to blame. Again, both of those are ways of deflecting the stress or anxiety that we're experiencing. But rather than control or blame, one tries always to better manage oneself and one's contribution to the situation, because the only person we have any amount of control over is ourself. I know you're about to say your spouse, but yourself. Yourself. We'll keep it right here. And again, only by God's grace. So congregations, like families, are living organisms. It's a moving target. Once you think you have it figured out, it kind of changes a little bit, that follow universal principles of systematic relationships. So that's part of what we're going to talk about tonight. Understanding these principles and the processes that operate in congregations will help clergy and lay leaders to better understand these 2 key things. And this is from a terrific book written by Israel Galindo, and he took family systems and he applies it to congregational life. So he's kind of covering both bases here a little bit. First, leaders will discover how a congregation works and why it sometimes doesn't work, because you're looking at it through different lenses when you're thinking in systems. And secondly, leaders will have a clearer understanding of their leadership role within the congregation. Now, when I read this, and I read another quote by Harvard University Press called Adaptive Leadership, it was taking a very similar principle of saying, in order to see what your role is within a system, you sometimes have to take a little step back, to remove yourself a little bit, to get a little distance from what's going on, to see what your role is, to see kind of what's going on. And in the book Adaptive Leadership, it describes it as getting on the balcony above a ballroom dance floor. Now, we're not going to dance, we're not going to, go there, but just think of like a Cinderella's ball, and getting up on the balcony, you can see all the couples, whereas if you're on the dance floor and they're all swirling around you, you can't quite take it off. But on the balcony, you can really survey the landscape and see what all's going on. In order not to stay there the whole time, no Rapunzel, you can't stay up there, to re-engage with the system that you're a part of. So again, it's just a momentary stepping back, similar to Sabbath. It's a momentary stop. It's a momentary pause to gain a little perspective and then to re-engage. Okay, I may have that quote here a little bit later on, I forget. My father-in-law, a wise man, many years ago, before I ever started my doctoral work, he gave me a book and I promised to read it. And I didn't. And I wished I had. This was the book that he gave me because he understood that there are many life experiences that a person brings into their ministry. And the two are very similar, and that's much of what I'm sharing with you here this week. But Generation to Generation by Edmund Friedman is just a great, great book that, again, takes family systems and congregational life and analyzes that a little bit. But he actually goes back to the source here in explaining how systems theory came about. So this is generation to generation, and talking about Dr. Edmund Friedman and Dr. Murray Bowen. So the thinking behind Ed Friedman's ideas is based on the systems theory of Dr. Murray Bowen. At the National Institute of Health in the 1950s, Dr. Bowen was able to observe families with severely dysfunctional offspring or children. He saw how the emotional process took over in these families to such a degree that they were being led by their most anxious, dependent members, resulting in more and more anxiety and crisis for the family unit. Now let me stop there and unpack that a little bit. So this is in very severe mental disorder situations where someone was literally being hospitalized or institutionalized. This was the 1950s. But Murray Bowen saw things from a wider perspective on Sundays when the family would come and visit their family member to see how they were doing. And he would watch the interaction of the whole family, not just focusing on the dysfunction of that poor child that was suffering from, mental disorders of whatever kind, but he watched the interaction of the family, and then he considered how that affected the family and how that affected his patient. And so he began to really approach his treatment processes from a much holistic standpoint, not just the patient presenting in front of him, but the whole family system. It's an approach that's used not only in psychology, but in other settings. But Friedman observed that the same process was often the story of churches and synagogues. The congregation and clergy were being led by the most dysfunctional members of the organization. I'm going to say a couple of things, and I'm not even going to look up, but I'm kidding. But there are systems in which the most dysfunctional person is in control of that system. I've seen it in board meetings, I've seen it in families, I've seen it in organizations. And oftentimes it's because we don't want to risk confronting, or maybe we've tried confronting, or we've tried to fix it, or whatever. The challenge remains for everyone else in the room to take on a more mature stance in how we deal with one another. But there is often the factor of sinking to the lowest common denominator. You've heard that phrase. And that's really the easiest way out when we think about decision making or getting along. And this is often either, it can sometimes be the weakest person in the room, or it can be the strongest person in the room. It again has an interesting dynamic of how things play out. But this is true for families, and this is true for the gathering of families, like church. So a dynamic that has much potential, but also a dynamic that can be navigated in a healthy way. And I think we often do. What Dr. Murray Bowen had hypothesized is a scale of differentiation. The root of differentiation is different. It's I'm different from you, you're different from me. So being self-differentiated is to be self-determined. It's not to just go along with the crowd, but it's to be an individual who God created you to be. To define your own life's goals, to define your own values apart from the surrounding togetherness pressures, to be able to say I when others are demanding you or we or a more collective type of opinion. It indicates the capacity to maintain a relatively non-anxious presence, which is kind of the secret sauce of self-differentiation, the ability to remain not very anxious. I can't go with non-anxious, but less anxious is probably a better way of terming it. Why is a person less anxious? Is because they place much less importance on the hubbub around them. Even though they can listen to the information, they're not sucked into the emotion of it and basically caving into whatever the crowd wants them to do. They're being self-determined. To make maximum responsibility of one's own destiny and emotional being. It can be measured somewhat by the breadth of one's repertoire of responses when confronted with crisis. That's another way of saying there are more options than fight, flight, or freeze. To have a wider repertoire of choices when you're met with an anxious situation. It doesn't always mean freeze, it doesn't always mean fight, and it doesn't always mean run. Family systems theory assumes the existence of an instinctual rooted life force, differentiation, or what is also called individuality, in every human being. And I believe that's God-given. Have you read lately how precious in God's sight you are? How uniquely fashioned you are? The world is populated with, I think, over 8 billion people, and even biological twins have differences. I claim to have a doppelganger in Wyoming. My doppelganger. We both had kids that attended Campion at the same time, and we've crossed paths a number of times. But it's mainly our haircut and beard that make us look alike. But I'm a pastor and he's an eye doctor. So again, we're very different people. So again, individuality, who God created us to be, and to be a separate person, an individual with the ability to think, feel, and act for yourself. That's what it is to be emotionally mature, okay? Also assumed is the existence of an instinctually rooted life force called togetherness that propels child and family to remain emotionally connected and to operate in reaction to one another. This is very, very important when you're an infant. This is very, very important as a child. It becomes less important as an adolescent, and then you're an adult. So there's a process from when you're going from healthy togetherness to healthy individuality, whereas there are some that remain and it becomes an unhealthy togetherness, which is what we're going to talk about here in just a moment. When we're overly dependent on others as opposed to being a healthy individual. So individuality and togetherness are kind of like two kids on the playground on either side of a seesaw, okay? Kind of back and forth. And yes, there is a balancing point. There is a balancing point. Individuality is the biological life force that motivates independent feeling, thinking, and acting for oneself with a lack of concern for what others feel, think, and act. Now, that doesn't mean, I don't care what you think. No, that's an immature response, isn't it? It's being able to listen to what other people think, but then to decide for yourself. That can be hard, because in so doing, you might disappoint other people with the decision that you want to make. And so you make a decision that you're okay with so that you don't make others upset with you. That's kind of bordering on some unhealthy togetherness, but it depends on the importance of the decision. If you're choosing a spouse versus buying a new pair of shoes, the stakes are differently, right? Let's hope. In both cases, you're looking for your soulmate. Oh, I get it, okay. I just make this up. Humans were created to function each as a separate person and to follow one's own compass. This is true of every human. And yet, God said, it is not good. First time all week he uttered those words, right? Let there be light, there was light. Ah, it's good. Let there be this, it was good. Let there be that, it's good. He got to day 6. Adam, this is not good. It's not good for you to be alone. So again, we were created for relationships, but it doesn't take away our individuality. So togetherness is a biologically rooted life force that propels an individual to follow the directives of others, to be dependent, to be connected, but to be an indistinct entity. And those last two words probably describe the worst case scenario. To be so closely fused to someone else, you have no idea who you are. And again, that's a very extreme circumstance. Some call it codependency. There's a lot of different terms for it. We'll refer to it a little bit later as fusion. But again, a marriage or a friendship is made up of two healthy individuals coming together. And there's an old movie in which a line was said that just sounds so romantic. And the line was, "You complete me." Oh, really? That sounds good, Hollywood, but it doesn't quite work that way. You might even say, "I feel more complete when we're together," but I just can't go with this whole idea of there is no me without you. Are you with me? Maybe so. Okay. Individuality pushes you hard from the inside out toward being distinct, unique, and an individual. Togetherness, however, pushes you just as strongly from the outside in, pressuring you to conform, to be a part of the group, to lay aside your personal principles and commitments. It's no wonder that the fatherless find a gang. They're looking for a sense of belonging. They don't know yet who they are, and they join in and are essentially told what to do, with some big-time consequences if they don't. Not encouraging gangs, just recognizing a social reality for some that we have this desire to belong and to interact in a healthy way, but again, unhealthy togetherness is not the answer. Togetherness is sometimes called fusion, which results when one seeks to take on or give up self in a relationship. A person who is more highly differentiated avoids the traps of fusions, emotional enmeshment. I know some big words here, but yet they are flexible, adaptable, and self-sufficient. I think maybe the next slide kind of helps illustrate it. There it is. We'll get to it here. So again, we kind of come to the end of defining these two concepts of individuality and togetherness. And it's not that one is good and one is evil. There is unhealthy individuality where you literally can't stand to be around anybody else. You just want to do your own thing by yourself. I mean, never interact with other people. And that's not a good thing. There's an unhealthy togetherness that you cannot be alone. You always have to have other people around you, and you just fall apart when you're not. And recognizing those, again, we're coming at this from a standpoint of self-awareness, and then it's a matter of, then once I understand this about myself, how do I want to live? Again, it's not always from jumping off one end of the seesaw and running to the other end and jumping on it. Sometimes it's just scooting a little bit more toward the center and a little bit more balance. Relational fusion is the blending and borrowing of one's identity with others, which is really confusing. And when you're a teenager, you're constantly making these transactions. You're constantly blending and borrowing from other. It's like trying on sweaters. You know, does this one fit, or does that one fit, or does this make me look taller, or whatever else? I mean, you're trying all kinds to discover who you are. And it's, again, the Kelley Blue Book mentality, constantly comparing yourself to others. Borrowing from that, oh, I wish I was more like him or her. I had a friend, Dennis, who was a couple years older than I in high school, and man, he he could make threes from all over the basketball court. I wanted to be just like him, and thought he was so cool. He is cool, and he's good at basketball, but he's who he is, and I'm who I am. But at that time, I can remember thinking, man, I wish I was like him. So again, this idea of blending and borrowing identity, it can result in blurry relationship boundaries because you're at that point unsure who you are, and make it difficult to discern where one individual stops and another begins. The greater the anxiety, the greater the fusion, the tighter the grip on that togetherness. So this idea of pressing together is predictably the first step in the development of dysfunctional emotional systems. For a group of people, and with some within that group to be more individuality and some to be more togetherness, you can kind of sense a herding together when anxiety rises. It's just sort of a pressing together. We talked a little bit about that earlier in the week. Whereas those that have a higher level of individuality, there's a little more of a tolerance of the tension that they're sensing about a decision or whatever else, and they're able to stay with it and not just fuse with, okay, what do you think we should do, guys? What do you think we should do? And there's a little bit more of a rational approach to analyzing what, and that's why we need a variety of people around the table. We need each other. Because in every group, there's a variety. So relational fusion occurs when one dominates and the other dissolves. That's kind of like on the left, we have a healthy interaction of two individuals, and on the right, one sort of swallows up the other. One sort of disappears into the background. And this works wonderfully if one is an overfunctioner and the other is an underfunctioner. It's just how it's expressed. Again, not saying that's a good thing, but we'll continue. I know we're taking our time with this first section, but the concept of individuality and having a healthy sense of self is really the foundation of family systems and of emotional intelligence. Those two conversations, if you will, share a lot of the same principles. If the balance is weighted toward individuality, the person is more able to think for self, independent of group or relationship pressures. Again, given the example I gave earlier. Though he or she can cooperate in groups and relationships, there is more thought out and chosen. The person is not automatically doing what others want reflectively simply because they want it. Relationships are thus less trouble. So there's less anxiety, less worry about what other people think. Responses are more appropriate, not as reactive. They're based more on fact and thinking things through, and life takes on a bit more of a smoother course. This life is governed more by thinking and planning based on objective fact, logic, and principle. Without all the colors, all the crayon colors, you can't make a beautiful picture. So if someone with a very high degree of individuality, they only see in dark grays and blacks, this is just very clear to them. You really need other levels, again, on the scale of differentiation. It takes all of us to really complete a full picture. But just recognizing how you're wired and what level of individuality you might be is important, particularly when stress comes along. I think that's saying a lot of the same thing. Most people want to be individuals, but not everyone is willing to give up on the togetherness the togetherness required to achieve more individuality. In other words, it's too comfortable to just kind of go along with the crowd rather than try to run against the wind like I was this morning. It's easier to run with the wind, right? People frequently are willing to be individuals only to the extent that the relationship system approves and permits it. In other words, any system has a little bit of wiggle room, but once you really define self, this example will make a little more sense later as well, but when one member of a system recognizes something that they need to change, it really messes with the whole system. For instance, if one has really leaned toward togetherness, and they always seem so nice and agreeable, right? They just kind of go along with what everybody else wants to do. What happens if they say no? I don't want to do that. Everybody, what? You always go along with, you never care where we go to eat. Well, tonight I have an opinion. Well, who gave you permission to have an opinion? It upsets the system because they're used to that functioning from you. So again, once we make the choice to change something in this, it will have an effect on the system around us. So I love this quote from Desire of Ages. Jesus possessed a dignity and individuality. That word kind of popped off the page as I was studying through all this. A dignity and individuality wholly distinct from earthly pride and assumption. What that says is that Jesus' identity was separate, healthy, separate from the expectations and biases of others around him. He was who he was. He did not strive for worldly greatness. And that wasn't just his humility, but it was his identity, or even the approval of others. And again, I inserted that. He didn't strive for worldly greatness, and even in the lowliest position, he was content. Wasn't at any time trying to appear bigger or more important than he is, but again, very comfortable in his own skin. It's wonderful being around a very healthy and emotionally mature person because they're not threatened. They're often calm, and they make good, solid friends that'll actually listen to you and respond to you, not just responding back at you. Again, I think there's a lot of value in deepening our individuality. So Galatians 6, 4, and 5 from the Message translation, I love how this is translated here by Eugene Peterson. Make a careful exploration of who you are and the work you have been given to do. So this separates the being from the doing beautifully. But then once you find what you're supposed to do, then throw yourself into it. Go for it. Sink yourself into that. Don't be impressed with yourself, and don't compare yourself with others. Wonderful advice, not just for teenagers. Each of you must take responsibility for doing the creative best you can with your own life. This is stewardship. This is living out the best life that God has called me to. And again, it doesn't mean that we don't seek the input of those close to us or those we love. It doesn't mean we don't value other people's opinions and thoughts. In fact, we're able to engage with them in a non-threatening way. We're able to consider a different idea that's crossways with ours without feeling threatened. Well, maybe we do feel a little threatened. Well, let's maybe think that through a little bit. Maybe there's something we can apply to what we already consider to be true. And we'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow night as we talk about how to determine your core values. We've referenced a little bit overfunctioning and underfunctioning. And perhaps on the back side of one of the handouts you saw, a list of little questions. We're going to hand that back out at this time, that over-functioning inventory, and we're going to see just how good it is, or how bad it is. No, how good it is by taking this. But I will already warn you that most leaders tend to be over-functioners. But there are certain traits about over-functioning where it's not just task-oriented. But let's read the definition, because this one kind of smarts. So I'll just warn you if you've already read that first sentence. Over-functioners are always busy. There's that four-letter word, busy. Okay, well, we've determined that busyness is not a sin. It's when I draw too much of my identity from being busy that I start to get in trouble, right? Okay. Well, over-functioners are always busy, but they are busy going about someone else's business because they lack the ability to set clear boundaries about their own goals and the needs of others. Uh-oh. That's where it kind of hurts a little bit. When we get busy doing other people's business. My grandma used to call that meddling. Now, it's okay to talk with someone about decisions they need to make. It's a whole nother to just make that decision for them. And it can often come with some really well-intentions. Well, I just thought you would like such and such and such and such. Well, you could have asked me, or I was going to do that in the next 5 minutes, but you went ahead and did it. Now, when it comes to emptying the dishwasher, if you want to overfunction in my house, that is just fine. You can. All you want. All you want. No, this is a little more than emptying the dishwasher or taking out the trash. This is applying to other areas, but it's really a lack of clear boundaries. It's, again, doing for others what they themselves should be doing for themselves. And therefore, you're literally fueling their underfunctioning by overfunctioning, okay? So without clear boundaries and guiding principles, overfunctioners anxiously help and do for others what others could easily do for themselves. That is motivated by the unhealthy need for approval, sought by meeting the expectations of others, which often leads to an unhealthy codependency. Man, there is so much in those few sentences, but this runs alongside the addiction of the need to be needed. As a sense of who you are, as a sense of feeling good about yourself, you need others to need you. Now, there's nothing wrong with that parental love or that familiar love or that friendship love of others depending on you and needing you and valuing your friendship. But again, if that's where you draw your primary sense of who you are, then you become dependent on others needing you. And there's a diminishing return if you're really measuring your value. Okay, I'm sorry, you're taking the quiz, aren't you? You're already filling this thing out. Okay, excellent, good students, good students. I'm gonna go back to that, and I'm gonna go back to that, I'm gonna go back to that, and that. Okay, there's the inventory. So we can do it together. We'll go back and catch those other slides, but I generally know the right way to do things. Is that a good thing? It sure is if you're a car mechanic. Yeah, I want to take my vehicle to someone that knows what to do, right? Okay, that's a good thing. I move in quickly to advise or fix things lest they fall apart. Okay, all right. I have difficulty allowing others to struggle with their own problems. Again, I want to go in there and fix it if they would only just do that, you know. All right. In the long run, it's simply easier to do things myself. We may have even uttered those exact words, right? Because it's true in the short term. I don't trust that others do as good of a job as I can. Okay. I often do what is asked of me even if I'm already overloaded. In other words, I cannot say no, and other people know it. Yeah. And again, I'm glad this meeting is not happening around nominating committee. We've already clarified that. I don't like to rock the boat, so I cover for other people's shortcomings. That might sound kind at first, doesn't it? Other people describe me as stable and as always having it together. Okay, a couple more. I don't like asking for help because I don't want to be a burden. And then just very plainly, I like to be needed. Most of these statements, in and of themselves, seem like pretty good things. But it's the combination and quantity of these that can lead us into difficult waters. Well, if you checked, and again, this is from, I love this book. This was put together by Jerry Scazzaro, Pete Scazzaro's wife, and she wrote a book called I Quit. I Quit. And you know what she did? Because of all the expectations on the pastor's spouse, she quit going to her husband's church. She says, I don't need this, I quit. Y'all are being mean. She quit for a short period of time. Great book about boundaries, about what's reasonable and what's unreasonable. Okay, so this is Jerry Scazzaro. This is her putting this together. But if you check 3 or more boxes, you may be overfunctioning. If you checked 4 to 7, you probably have a moderate case of overfunctioning. If you scored 8 or above, these are her words, you're in trouble. Her words. Again, this can add to our self-awareness that one of the simplest interventions when you're being tempted to overfunction is to simply slow down for that moment and ask yourself, do I really need to do that which that person could do for themselves? Because that's really the definition of overfunctioning. It could be overfunctioning if you're out mowing your lawn and you mow your neighbor's lawn. Now, if your neighbor, hear me, if your neighbor is in a wheelchair, that is a very good thing you just did. If your neighbor has 2 teenagers, they can probably figure out how to mow the lawn. So again, it's doing for others what they themselves could do for themselves when we think about overfunctioning. I promised I'd go back a couple slides here. Our man Moses was a classic overfunctioner, and he felt it was God's calling on him to overfunction and lead all these people, these complainers, these bickerers and moaners and complainers out of Egypt. But he took it all on himself, and he was burning out. But his father-in-law said, Moses, this is not good. You are killing yourself. You need to divide up the responsibility. You need to release some of your leadership to others to help you do this task. And Moses thought that was a pretty good idea. A really good idea. An overly committed heart can easily lead to overcommitted schedules. And overfunctioning originates more from a place of human ego than from divine calling. Ooh. We are not saved by how often our name appears in the church directory under the nominating committee. Our church is blessed by your service. Don't get those two mixed up. But it's not salvation by office. It's the attachment to our identity that we have to be dangerous of. It's great if you're so talented you can do 14 different things. Okay, 18 different things. But again, if that's where our truest identity comes from, we'll eventually be disheartened. But guess what? Again, when we think about the system overly relies on the overfunctioners in the room. I've seen siblings do it. See that dirty laundry on the floor? I don't need to pick that up. My sister will pick that up. She hates it when stuff is out of place. so I don't have to do it. Johnny comes downstairs for breakfast. Mama asks him, Johnny, did you make your bed? No, Mama did. Well, honey, just eat your breakfast. And Mama goes upstairs and makes Johnny's bed. Johnny is 12. He could make his bed, but he'll never have to as long as Mama continues making his bed. Very, very simple task, but overfunctioning can bleed into a lot of different areas of life. But here's the lie. Here's the lie the devil would have you believe regarding overfunctioning, is that it really does depend on you. And if you quit, everything is going to fall apart. But you know what? Occasionally that's true. And it's a little scary. If you're a student and you don't get your assignment done, well, yeah, that's a bad thing. But there are certain things in life that really aren't totally and completely dependent on us. And it's sometimes determining and prioritizing, but again, we can get into this idea of a Messiah complex, that I'm needed, I'm the savior of this group or this function. And again, if I stop juggling, all the balls will fall. I have learned that some of the balls are made of rubber. And they might bounce, and I might catch them again, and they might just roll away, and they're not as needed as I thought. And that's kind of the secret of it. Again, using that illustration of juggling, if your spouse and children are crystal balls, you don't want to drop them. But there might be other things in your life that aren't quite as important and valuable to you that, well, once in a while, maybe just set them down gently and keep going. Boy, I better press on. Cynthia Maybeck, when we stop overfunctioning, it rocks the institution because the expectation is that we will. We will. Need something done? Call the busiest person. Happens in a lot of different systems. Oh, we already covered that. All right. It's one thing, again, in the calmness of this room to think about these things. It's another when anxiety shows up and the heat gets turned up underneath the pot. And that's when those that tend to be overfunctioners kick into gear. And you heard me reference earlier this simple concept of, in a crisis, do you get bigger or smaller? If you get bigger, that means you're overfunctioning and you get bossy and you just get things done. And again, we need those firemen and nurses and whatever else that just go into that mode. And then there's the ones that shrink down and want to hide in the corner and wait till the storm goes by. You know, the underfunctioners. But this just gives some descriptors from a different author of what's going on in underfunctioning and overfunctioning under stress. Okay, lots of words. Triangles. This is something that we'll talk about a little bit again on Sabbath. But each and every one of us is an invited member into dozens of triangles. And it's so much fun. Not really. Oftentimes when you get a text or when the phone rings or when someone wants to talk to you, hey, can I talk to you for a minute? Well, sure. Okay, well, I've been having a problem with so-and-so. Welcome to a triangle. Again, it's pretty simple. It has three sides, but the basic principle of an emotional triangle is that when any two parts of a system get uncomfortable with each other, then one of them triangles in a third party, not to solve the problem, but to feel less anxious about it. Did you notice what I said? Now, every once in a while, that third person can be very helpful and offer some advice, and then they send that person back to the person they're in conflict with. Good job. That's the way to do it. Sometimes, and if you're an overfunctioner, And a fixer, you'll say, oh, I know them really well. Let me just call them and talk with them for a little bit. Oh boy. That might help you. It might make you feel kind of good because you're about to fix somebody else's problem, but it might not work. And it's not going to work in the long term because it'll only continue to fuel the underfunctioning of the person that approached you about their problem with that other person, right? So again, a lot of these things work in tandem, but oftentimes that third person is simply a stabilizing agent. And you might even hear on the other end of the line that person say at the end of the phone call, oh, thanks, I feel so much better. That's an indication that maybe you just relieved their anxiety. I'd rather have them feel better about how they're going to approach the person that they have the conflict with after having a brief conversation with you. But sometimes those conversations can go on for quite a long time. And it's not a sin to participate in those kinds of conversations. We have to be careful how we navigate. Triangles cannot be avoided. They just can't be. It's a simple function of how we live. But again, this third person is often the target of the other two's anxiety. Bummer of a birthmark, Hal. That's a little Far Side humor for those that, the deer with the, anyway. As people seek to shift the burden, there is less interest. And I was amazed by this. And this is Peter Steinke, who wrote a lot on church family life and anxiety. Peter Steinke out of Texas. There is less interest in solving the issue, but more concern with simply being relieved of the anxiety. And again, that, oh, thank you, I feel better. Does that look familiar? And again, that expression of the one down at the bottom. Oh boy, oh boy. But triangles are a very, very natural part and just constantly occurring all around us. But what should be a leader's role? If you are a fixer or if you are a pleaser, the temptation will be not only to offer counsel, but to offer more help and do for them what they should be doing for themselves. How does Matthew 18 work into this? And I know we kind of overuse and oversimplify Matthew 18, but when there is conflict between two parties, we are to go to each other. Now, looping in a third person is the next step if they have not heard us. And to be heard is to be understood, right? Not just, oh yeah, I heard your words, but go away, go away. If you can't solve it one-on-one, that might be another time to, again, loop in another person, but you're still the active agent in trying to solve that issue. This isn't about ganging up on the other person, but somehow trying to resolve it, again, between A and B. Again, overfunctioners are prone to march headlong into boundary violations and breaking Matthew 18. We'll actually talk about this in the sermon on Sabbath, but Martha and Mary and Jesus. By the way, in this scene, where's Lazarus? He's not mentioned. I think he's the underfunctioner of the home. And I'll go into it more. I'll try to keep it brief here, but on Sabbath, when the story is told by Luke, Dr. Luke says that Jesus went to Martha's home. He went to, this is Martha's house. Martha is in charge. But we remember the scene. Martha wants to make the visit of Jesus just a wonderful experience. And of course, we have to eat. We have to eat. In any kind of fun, get together, we got to eat. And so she's busy making sure that we have something good to eat. I like Martha. Mary, on the other hand, would rather do nothing more than to sit and listen to Jesus. And it's beautiful. It's wonderful. And again, Lazarus is maybe over in the corner, just kind of observing everything, staying out of it. But notice what happens in this triangle. Martha is at conflict with Mary. So who does Martha go to? She goes to Jesus. And notice her very direct words. And you're getting a preview of what others will hear on Sabbath morning. But she says to him, Lord, do you not care? Oh, better put my finger away. Do you not care that my sister has left me alone to serve? Tell her. There's the triangle, exclamation point. When somebody is saying, you tell them for me to do something. Whew. And Jesus doesn't fix it. He doesn't fix it. There is tension in the room, and Jesus doesn't fix it. He simply observes Martha's choices, and he observes the choice that Mary has made. Now again, Jesus is Jesus. I don't know how much further Martha was going to push this, yeah, that's fine, but Jesus, go tell her anyway, I don't know. But I love his response, his non-anxious response of not fixing it. He could have said, Mary, it's been so nice visiting with you, but just for a few minutes, can you go help Martha in the kitchen, and then we'll all be able to eat and continue our time together and whatever else. No, he doesn't. He doesn't. And in his response, he uses the word, you are worried and troubled. And I think he's addressing something in the present and something in their family history. Martha, you have resentment toward Mary over the embarrassment she brought to this home. She went away as a prodigal. She came back. So there are already issues and conflict between these two sisters that in this anxious moment, boom, it comes out. Fascinating story. Last one. Who remembers Elmer's glue? Oh man, Elmer's glue and those scissors that couldn't cut in school. Fusion and cutoff. Again, when we get uncomfortable enough to want to fuse to someone else, or when we get uncomfortable enough with someone else that we want to cut off. It happens in families, it happens in churches. Again, fusion again is like the unhealthy togetherness. We've already kind of covered that concept. But emotional cutoff is what the brother who didn't leave home did to the prodigal. It's, I'm done with you. You've gone too far. You caused me too much anxiety or stress, so you're out of my life. That's emotional cutoff. And we might never actually say the words, but we seldom ever pick up the phone with that family member, with that friend. Emotional cutoff is just another protective instinct. Rather than standing out from others, a person may stand outside of their circle. Cutoff is an exaggeration of the need to be separate. I can only count on myself. I'll go it alone. When cut off, a person attempts to gain a sense of identity over and against another person. This is not what it means to be self-differentiated. Self-differentiation allows others to be who they are. Emotional cutoff is judgment on those people that you're separating yourself from. It can sometimes be interpreted as a superiority complex. Again, in the Galatians 6, it says, don't compare yourself to others. Well, that's exactly what the Pharisee was doing at the temple, right? Lord, I'm so glad I'm not like him. Yeah, that's healthy. So, in not seeking to confuse the word fusion, but you understand that it's an overblending, a welding together of two parts that weren't meant to be, okay? There's also So that's relational fusion with two people. But there can also be emotional fusion where your thoughts and feelings get so tangled that your feelings really take over and rule the roost and not your thinking. So that's more of an internal fusion of your thoughts and feelings, and you have a diminished capacity to figure out what is what between thoughts and feelings. A tough place to be, particularly when we get anxious. So emotional fusion occurs when one person dominates and the other dissolves. We've talked about that. When premium value is placed on harmony, acceptance, and belonging, people resist information that might disturb their peace because no one wants to speak the truth. It's sometimes just in approaching change that might seem too painful to want to endure to get to the other side of that change, because it's loss, it's different, we're losing what we've been used to having. So some things to think about as we conclude here tonight. I know we've touched on a number of different topics here. There are actually a total of 8 family systems principles, and these were just 4 of them. It's believed that before Dr. Bowen passed away, he was working on a 9th theory of family systems. And that's the one that had much more of a spiritual component to it. It wasn't looking at the individual and just their family. He was dabbling a little bit in the idea that there's a higher power. And again, this was during an era in which psychology and religion were just polarized. They were very, very, very different schools of thought. To see a certified Christian counselor is a very, very good thing, but even they are swimming upstream in the world of psychology, which is again very humanistic. But there's speculation that Murray Bowen was working on sort of this 9th principle of systems theory that brought into account that our maturity and our identity is also driven by God, which again is where the Christian experience comes in. And so much of what we've talked about here this evening has very much that human element. But when we add the divine element, we again add the hope of restoration, the hope of wholeness, the hope of healing. Because without that, where are we? So again, as we encounter, whether it's just the differences that create tension or whether we uncover some deep challenges, we know that the power of the gospel is still at work and can continue to provide the way. But identify some ways that you may overfunction when stressed. I can recall as a kid, again, because my parents were so busy teaching all week and then leading worship on Sabbath mornings, that Friday afternoons were a bit chaotic because they were coming off their teaching schedule, but also trying to get ready for Sabbath. Sometimes there were people coming over to our house to rehearse a song or whatever it was. Other times it was running here and there, just doing those last minute things to get ready for Sabbath. And what's so interesting about getting ready for Sabbath rest is being so stressed about it as you're getting ready for Sabbath rest. But again, it was just a part of all the giftedness that they offered and the things that they wanted to do. It was just sometimes too much. So again, thinking about things and times in which we may tend to overfunction. It could be just one of those parental moments where the kids are fighting and you just want to put a lid on it and just stop it, At that moment, it may cease that current squabble, but nobody in the room has learned how to solve anything in that moment. It might take other instances where they're allowed to go a few steps further and solve it themselves. So again, that overfunctioning is often not doing the other party a favor. What may be driving your impulse to overfunction. And again, whether that's the need to be needed, to always stay busy enough, whatever the source may be, there's a lot of reasons people are led to be overfunctioners. And then finally, how might you approach triangles differently with a new awareness of what's going on? Let's face it, it's nice to feel needed in that moment when someone calls, hey, can I talk to you about something? Well, sure, I'm happy to help. But beware of how you help. Once you recognize this may be a triangle, and again, it doesn't hurt to, well, you might consider, or, hey, when I see you next time, tell me how that conversation went, or just encouraging them to do for themselves what they can do for themselves. Again, it's such a temptation to intervene and to overstep when those triangles show up, and they do tend to show up around us a lot. Let's conclude with prayer, and thank you for your attention tonight. Lord, as the sun comes out before sunset, it's been a bit of a blustery day, but we are very thankful for your grace and for your presence in our lives. As we've talked about how we interact with each other, our tendencies, how we act under stress or anxiety, we again just recognize our humanity and our need of your grace. Lord, teach us to know ourselves well enough that we can make good decisions even in those anxious times. To be aware of our weaknesses, to lean into you, to seek healing even of the things that hold us back. We want to be healthy, emotionally mature disciples of yours that just make the gospel look so attractive to others. It doesn't mean that we don't make mistakes, but when we do, we're willing to own them and not be defensive or blaming. So Lord, just teach us to grow, even in the painful times of growth. Teach us to depend on you, and thank you for your everlasting love. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you so much, Craig. That was insightful, right? Especially the part on the triangles and how we easily pull people into our little squabbles and things, right? I wonder if you can help me again tonight as we draw a name, talking about drawing people into things.
Whose name was I supposed to draw? All right. Okay, how about that?
Deborah Easler. Ah.
Yeah. All right.
Hey. Gift card to Eat Thai. So there's a couple more giveaways to get, so make sure that you swing by tomorrow night, and then also on Saturday. We have 2 more books to give away and maybe some extras. So you just never know. But on top of that, a lot more good content coming your way. And if you have questions that you're kind of wondering, that kind of thinking about, man, there was something I had a question about, please write those down. We're going to have a Q&A session on Saturday at 10 a.m. Here, and there will be a platform where you can ask your questions, and we'll try and answer them as best as we can. Or Craig will. I'm going to try not to overfunction. Thank you so much for coming, and please have a good night, drive safe, and we will see you tomorrow.